Good morning, good evening, good night, all you people wherever you are. We are back. Really excited to be back.
Urban Bible Stories. We are back at it. Episode 4, I believe we are on.
Yes, yes. This would be episode 4. I guess at this point we can say it's a new season since we're in
Or
a
new era, if you will.
a new era. We're in a new format, as you can see. So we took some time off around the holidays, and we were doing once a month episodes because that was really all that time allowed for us. And so I think we figured we'd sacrifice a little bit of the production value, but give you guys a lot more content. So for the people that have been listening, they've been wanting more. So we're gonna try to give you guys once a week. We're gonna try to come out once a week and just drop this, Zoom format, COVID format, if you will. So we're really excited about that. Excited to kind of be back and doing this, and I'm really excited about this particular kind of season that we're moving into. We started off last year looking at the primordial stories. So it's kind of those like myth stories, the flood and the creation and things like that. But I think we really wanted to get into the man himself, the man, the legend, for some of
Jesus.
it.
We're
Jesus,
jumping into
JT.
Jesus.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about Jesus today. We're actually going to hit the Christmas story, even though it's pretty much February. But it's fine. We'll do a little rewind on that. And yeah. So how have you been, Amy, since we've all last seen you?
Yeah, so I mean I'm trying to think back. I guess it was about November the last time we recorded.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously I've seen you since then, but for folks listening, and of course as soon as I start talking, one of the changes of being at home is other noise.
Yeah.
And Dolly, my dog, anytime I start speaking and I'm not speaking to her, she likes to start noise. So Dolly is starting her puzzle as soon as I'm starting to talk. Um, but okay, lost my train of thought. How have I been? Yeah, it's been busy. Dolly, Jesus Christ.
Of course.
This is this is one of the things we'll deal with at home
I know. I know. I'm leaving
is
all that in.
sweet little Dolly, sweet little
Yeah.
Dolly.
Yeah.
She just came in, just hit her puzzle for like 30 seconds and just went back to bed.
Yeah.
Dolly.
I'm sure
Yeah, no, things
I'll have
things
I'll
have been
have
good.
children coming in at some point. So it's all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, it's been a busy time. I did go back to North Carolina for Christmas.
Nice.
Um, it was a pretty chaotic, very fast trip.
Mm.
It's about 2 weeks we have off, which it's a good amount of time, but it takes a day to drive down there from New Jersey. And Dolly does not make the drive much easier, do you, baby? But it was good to see my family. We went to see my mother's brother, and so my uncle Jim and my aunt Kim in Georgia outside of Savannah. So out of the 2 weeks, I had about 4 days driving. Um, but it was good. It's always great to see people and spend time with family. Dolly, actually, we had a puppy filled Christmas. There were 5 dogs in the house.
Wow.
Um,
It's a lot of dogs.
a lot of dogs. It was a good time though. What about you? How was your Christmas break?
My Christmas was really nice. It was really, really nice. We spent a lot of time just family, just us and the kids. And it's one of my favorite times of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Both for like spiritual, like it's one of my favorite times of the year to be in church. So there's like kind of that piece of it, but it's also just one of my favorite times of the year in general. My mother was a big Christmas person. We were, one of
Mm-hmm.
our traditions, putting up the tree together and everything like that. So obviously having a family now and like getting to do that with my kids is so much fun. Getting to just take them to light shows and all kinds of stuff like that, giving them presents and them running around and excuse me playing with their toys, and then just getting a little bit of time off of both school, like my schooling, but then also getting some time off of work as well is you just really can't beat that.
The rest and reset is always appreciated.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, we need it. I just ran into the first, not first problem, but something that I forgot about the Zoom thing is I got to make sure all the devices are charged. I got to
Oh yeah,
plug this.
that's always a thing.
Yeah, I gotta plug this bad boy in. Um, but yeah, so we're gonna jump in and excuse all the camera work here for a second while I try to make sure that I don't die on you guys. Oh, and that's not the right chart.
I can chit chat a little bit more about
Yeah,
some
I
Christmas
think I gotta
thoughts.
run them. Yeah, yeah.
Like this is Zoom was I was so good at Zoom.
Hmm.
Uh like literally a whole like year and a half in Guatemala. That's all I did. That's the whole way I taught. Just
I was gonna say that's
Zoom.
how we did everything. It's how we taught. It's how we did everything.
That's right. And honestly, I mean, even thinking about the classroom is one thing I've been thinking about as we adjust to this.
Hmm.
Even as I was reading through these stories, like the teacher brain in me is like, oh my gosh, I want to make a slide with a map of Nazareth, and I
Yeah.
want the path going from Egypt to Nazareth and going through Bethlehem, and what's the path
Yes.
that most likely would have been taken.
Yes. This is part of what I like. Do I have the book here or is it out there? If I don't have it here, I'll have to grab it at some point. I won't do it right now. But this is a good I think a good series for you as someone who sort of lived in the Holy Land. Because we're talking about Jesus, and you know we're inevitably talking about all these places in Palestine that exist. And I'll use this to sort of transition into kind of what how I want to introduce what we're talking about today. So for everyone who was listening in the past, and we were doing some little intros in the beginning, whether we were like reading poems or doing this, that, and the third. I thought about that today, but I realized we're entering a completely different genre of Bible, and so we
Mm-hmm.
probably should just talk about like what a gospel is before we even get into the readings that we had for today.
Well, and that actually kind of goes with some of my questions that I had for you. So
Yeah,
that's a great starting point. So yeah, what is a gospel? Please
yeah,
enlighten me, Donte.
got you. So gospel, the word that that we sort of translate into gospel literally translates to good news. And it's not unique to the Bible. So, for example, if you're familiar with Roman history, the Pax Romana or the Peace of Rome,
Mm-hmm.
that like edict was considered a gospel. And so, a gospel was something that was told to the people of a particular kingdom that were supposed to be good news, something for them to celebrate, something that was, noteworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so even like if Caesar had a baby, that would be a gospel declaration, right? And
Okay.
so already we're seeing right a lot of political language is being used.
Mm-hmm.
So I always find it funny when there's some people that are like, "Oh, keep Jesus out of your politics." It's like, well, you should tell Jesus that because there's a lot of politics when you talk about Jesus in general, right? It's not accidental that he uses phrases like King of Kings, Lord of Lords, or the Alpha and Omega, because these are phrases that were used to describe Caesar. Um, and so a gospel, there's a few things to kind of understand about gospels in general, and then I'll get into the four. But the biggest thing is that they're not biographies. And I think that that's
I've gotten that from the first couple chapters. Yeah.
yeah. Like the people really look at them like this is a historical account or something like that. And it is certainly more historical than the stuff we were talking about before, right? We were talking
Yeah.
about the flood and all of those kinds of things. And those had, maybe, I mean, the Garden of Eden story is really just a story to talk about larger issues. The flood
Right.
may have had a historical nugget attached to it. These, all scholars, virtually all scholars, um, atheist, agnostic, Christian, agree that there was a man named Jesus in Nazareth who was what do you call it, like a skilled laborer of some sort,
Mm-hmm.
who was an apocalyptic preacher of some sort, who was a messianic figure of some sort, who
Right,
had
like his
followers.
existence
Right.
is
Like there's some pretty
yeah.
key things that everyone agrees happened. Had followers, was crucified by Rome, executed by Rome, and
Mm,
was believed to have risen again. Right. Those are things that anyone of any belief system that's being serious about studying is going to say all of these things are likely true.
right.
But what the Gospels are trying to do is tell a story about Jesus. They're trying to get you to believe certain things about Jesus, and they're talking to very specific audiences. I saw one commentator almost put it in a phrase of marketing and say like you have to think that they're marketing this idea of Jesus. And we have four gospels in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there were likely perhaps hundreds at some point. We've recovered many, many, many other gospels, sayings, gospels that just have like Jesus said this, Jesus said this, Jesus said this. There's a gospel of Thomas, there's a gospel of Mary, right? There's all kinds of other extra biblical gospels. And the general belief is that during the first and second century, there were first oral stories of Jesus and what Jesus did and who Jesus was and what Jesus represented. And then
Mm.
eventually they started to write them down. Some of them fell out of favor for various reasons, and some of them became, ones that we hold on to for various
And
reasons.
that is part of what I'm curious about. But
Yeah.
yes.
So just to get us on to
But we've got the four. But
yeah, I
we've
was gonna
got
say let's
so out of all of the New Testament, so we're in the New Testament now.
right.
Why is it that these are the only four that are considered gospels compared to all of the books in the New Testament?
So I would say this for two main reasons. One is the reliability of these four.
Okay.
These are some of the earliest gospels that have been created. So the basic timeline, you have the Gospel of Mark, which most scholars date at about 70 CE. So yeah, I think Jesus dies in the 30s CE.
Uh-huh.
So you're
Mhm.
talking about 50 years, less than 40 years after the death of Jesus. Some people criticize that and they're like, "Oh, why did it take 40 years to write a guy?" But it's like if you read ancient history, like having something
That's how shit
written.
happens. That's
Yeah,
how modern history happens too.
yeah,
Yeah.
having something written for within 40 years of it happening in the first century is amazing. It's like
Yeah.
that's so that gives it a lot of credence. And then so you have Mark, which will be first, Matthew, which will be second, probably closer to like 90, 100, give or take. Luke in that same sort of region or that same area, like 95 ish, and then John, which is later into like the 100s. And the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they describe like Jesus's story. And then John is something, a little bit different. It's not called the synoptics. And so like the basic kind of overlay of the four gospels, uh, the author of Mark is very short and succinct and brief. He was talking to Greek, or they were talking to Greek people, but they definitely were not native Greek speakers. Mark's Greek is notoriously horrendous.
Okay.
It's the
Okay.
shortest gospel, and it shows Jesus as this really important teacher and healer and someone who is bringing a movement of some sort. Um, it is the
My
book that
yeah.
has the least divinity of Jesus.
My footnotes had a lot to say about the purpose
Mm-hmm.
of Matthew, and it does align with that. But they were basically saying, or like these footnotes and backgrounds.
Right,
It
right,
was
right.
like, yeah, background before the chapter was basically saying that. Actually, let me find my notes here.
Yeah.
Um, yes, that it was he's he's validating the and I know that you're not as into some of these covenants that all my footnotes
Yeah.
are so into, but that is how all this is framed, is that it's about the Abrahamic covenant, which we did see before, and I
Right.
remember reading about that one, but we did not read about the Davidic, is that even how you say it,
Yeah.
covenant?
Yeah.
Um,
So
but so but so they're emphasizing like the way this background information was describing this chapter is that it's emphasizing Jesus as like the righteous
yeah. So real quick, is that Matthew or Mark?
Matthew.
Okay, so it's weird
Sorry,
that
did I get it
like
mixed up? That were you talking about Mark and I
yeah,
jumped
I
to
was talking
Matthew?
about Mark, but
Okay, my bad.
that's a good no, but that's a good point because Matthew comes first in the Bible, but Mark
Well,
is
that
the first one written. So
okay.
they're
So
not in chronological order at all.
okay, okay. So okay. So repeat. Okay, can you tell me again? So Mark. Okay,
Mark
so
is the earliest written gospel.
was the earliest written. And what were
Yeah.
you saying? It's like the
It's the short, succinct one. It really emphasizes Jesus as this suffering servant who it's a declaration of Jesus's work. And it's probably the earliest source that gets used by the writers of Matthew and Luke. And if you notice today, we're talking about birth stories. I gave you birth stories from Matthew and Luke. Mark doesn't have them,
yeah.
right?
Well, that's I was gonna say I don't have a reference for that. I did
Right.
not read about Mark,
Yeah.
but that is interesting that it's the first. So why is that? Why is that? Well, okay. Like I said, the footnotes did say Matthew is making him as
Yeah. And that's
the
true.
God. Is that why that's the first gospel in the New Testament? Or is there
So
another?
that's a good question. There's a lot of theory as to why Matthew's gospel comes first. Um I I don't know that we really know why it
Mhm.
comes first. It could
Who
be now.
made that decision?
Hmm?
Who even made that decision?
So the way that that's a whole nother that'd be a whole nother episode how the Bible got canonized. But and the best answer is we really don't know. But I mean, we do know how it was canonized, but like we don't know the individual people and like the exact date that they did it. But we know that these four gospels were in favor in different communities. We even
Okay.
refer to like a Matthean community and a Markian community and a Johannine community. Like these were
Okay.
likely influential individuals who had followers and people adhered to their gospel. And again, they do appear to be pretty accurate historically to an extent, right? As accurate as something this ancient could be. They line up with what historians say about Jesus, like Josephus and Tacitus, when they mention Jesus and Jews in Palestine during this time. And Matthew is talking to his Jewish audience. Matthew connects Jesus to every prophecy he can from the Old Testament,
Okay.
or from the Hebrew Testament. So that in this case, the footnotes are not wrong. That in Matthew's gospel, Matthew really wants to present Jesus as as Jewish as possible. Matthew is the most quote unquote the most Jewish gospel. Luke is my favorite gospel, and that's
Okay.
because Luke is very concerned with the poor and disenfranchised. So you will see parallel stories from Matthew and Luke, where Luke really makes it a point to emphasize something that Jesus did for like women, or something that Jesus did for the poor, or something like that.
Well, even in the stories that you gave me, that's even apparent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so like, I mean, maybe this can even be a good transition into the actual story. So like with what that was one of the first things that I really noticed is, I started with Matthew.
Yeah.
So that was the first one. And it was kind of surprising to me that the story started off with the angel Gabriel speaking to Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And even though Mary is the woman who is actually
Right.
carrying this,
Mm-hmm.
the first story in the New Testament is focused on this narrative and this situation between these two. I mean, I assume the angel Gabriel is a man. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe we shouldn't be applying gender to
I was gonna
angels,
say
but
angels don't really have gender, but yeah.
but I guess yeah. I mean, my own bias assumption
Yeah.
applying it there. I'm sure I'm not the only
I was gonna
one.
say you're not alone.
But even the fact that the first story was emphasized on Joseph,
Hmm.
and then like that was just a bit surprising to me. Like when I think of the narrative of the nativity and the annunciation and the birth of Christ, Mary is typically the central figure.
Hmm.
And so that in itself was kind of interesting to me to read this first chronological story that's focused on Joseph. And then Luke was the one where we do have the greater emphasis on Mary.
Right.
So even just within those, like, these couple short chapters, that was clear. And once again, the footnotes I think did prove to be kind of accurate with part of what they were explaining, how Luke is more about like the human story
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
Jesus, of like his actual lived experience, where they were saying that like Matthew is more about like making him be this kingly gospel, or that's not the right word to use there. You just explained what gospel means, but to be this like divine character
Right.
more
Right. Right.
so.
Right.
Whereas Luke seems to be about like, yeah, his human story, which is also what I'm more curious in. So
Right.
that's I like to hear that that's also your favorite one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think all of that is true. And remember, and if we look at like, so why does Matthew start with, you have the wise men or the magi, you have King Herod, and you have Joseph, and like Joseph's sort of trial of knowing that his betrothed is pregnant, even though they haven't been together, all of those things. And this all goes back to trying to align Jesus to all of the messianic prophecies. So Jesus
Okay.
has to be born in Bethlehem, but from Nazareth. He's got to flee to Egypt. Why, wise people from the east have to come and see him. Like there's all these sorts of things that Matthew was very concerned with making sure the audience knows. And actually, if you look at Matthew 1 is almost all genealogy.
Oh
Right.
yes, that was one of the questions I had for you.
Hmm.
So my mother went to Catholic school,
Yeah.
and whenever my mom like talks about certain stories in the Bible, she always talks about like the begats.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's like they begat this, who begat this, who begat this, who begat this. And
Hmm.
that's what this whole thing seems to be. But
Yeah.
there was this emphasis on 14 generations.
Yeah.
And that was one of my questions for you, is like, is there a significance for I feel like there has to be some sort of significance for 14 generations.
So the biggest significance for Jesus's genealogy is to make sure that the audience knows that Jesus was descended from David, because
Okay.
if he's going to be the messianic king, right, the Messiah is supposed to come from the
And have
line
this
of David,
divine
from the
authority.
stump of Jesse, right, who Jesse was David's father. So that's the biggest part of the what you call it, of the genealogy.
Mhm.
Also, the numerical value of David's Hebrew name is 14. So there were a lot of they call it gematria, where numbers and words can sort of have similar meanings and things like that. That becomes important in the Book of Revelation. So it's not accidental that they have it lined up in 14 generations. But something that's really interesting um, about the genealogy, and this is where we already kind of get to some interesting things about Jesus. There's a few things that are really unusual about it. It's not unusual to have a genealogy listed in ancient texts of important people. It is
Mhm.
unusual to have women in your genealogy, because
I actually
women,
didn't notice that.
yeah, women were often unnamed, and they,
Uh-huh.
they were only known by their husband or father. So the fact that there are women named in the genealogy of Jesus already points to, and this, whether this was intentional or not, right? And it's interesting because Matthew's not the writer that we think is necessarily concerned with this, but whether it was intentional or not, women are like completely named, like full blown named in this in Jesus's genealogy, right? There's already in the line of Jesus or the tradition of Jesus some honor given to women that would be uncommon of this time. Another thing that's interesting as we continue on the idea of women is that Rahab is mentioned, and Rahab in the Old Testament was a prostitute. So
Okay. I
again,
definitely didn't know that.
yeah. So Rahab is, as a sex worker, is not supposed to be honorable, right? And again, that's not something that you would want um, to have listed in your genealogy. Yet we see it, right? So I think already we sort of have this really interesting, uh, you know, this really interesting look at the person of Jesus just through his genealogy, right? His genealogy includes women. His genealogy includes people of low class and people that were not supposed to be, happy about, or people that were supposed to be ashamed of. You already see Jesus being really close to the disenfranchised, right? Sex workers at this time are, as just like they are in modern day, sort of disenfranchised and cast aside, but they get named in the line of Jesus, right? Women being named is really important. So the genealogy is very interesting for that. And you have to think these gospel writers are trying to convince people of things. And some
Mhm.
people say that stuff like this really gives them a lot of credibility, because if they were going to simply lie about everything, then you might as well not mention the women. So the fact that they mention them, a lot of people say maybe it's there's probably some validity there, right? They probably are trying to be honest and be seen as honest, because otherwise they would hide it. And the fact that they didn't hide it actually bodes well for their credibility as authors. And so that's, to kind of go back to that question of why these four gospels. The other thing about these four gospels, too, before I even lose this thought, is that all four of these gospels are in some way, shape, or form connected to original disciples of Jesus. Um,
Okay.
how true it is
Like I did know, or
can
that
be
sounds
argued. Yeah, like Mark is listed as a companion of Peter, and I believe it's in Acts, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. Um, Luke is a physician, and supposed to have been close with Paul, and he's also the writer of Acts. Matthew is what was Matthew's connection? I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think Matthew was connected to, I think, one of the original. Let me see if I can find this real quick. Um, um, Matthew. Oh, Matthew is supposed to be one of the 12 disciples. So
Oh,
that's right.
okay.
Yeah, Matthew the tax collector. So Matthew's supposed to be connected to one of the 12 disciples. And John is also supposed to be connected to the beloved disciple. Now, most scholars are going to say that these books were not written by these single men. Like it wasn't
Mhm.
just Mark that penned this or just Matthew that penned this, but rather a community of scribes that kind of came together under the under the guidance and direction of these otherwise really famous people,
Mhm.
or people that had a following. So it's important to note that scholarship doesn't agree that it was just one singular person. But
Right.
again, adding to the validity, all of these authors have some connection to original disciples of Jesus.
Remember, I feel like we had been talking about a lot of the background though, or
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, we were
like
just
like good
starting to get to the
context for like
story.
what are the gospels, what are these
Right,
books?
right.
Should we get into the story?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's get into the story. What were your thoughts as you read through?
So, okay, so like I said before, one of the first things that was interesting to me was seeing the fact that the first story is centered around the father. Is
Mm-hmm,
centered around Joseph.
mm-hmm,
Um, let me see here. Okay. So you kind of already answered my first question. My first question that I had written down for you was, who is Matthew? What should we know about this guy? Why is he the first book?
mm-hmm. Yeah,
So you pretty much answered all of this because all the book said, or all of my footnotes said, was that Matthew is also Levi.
Yeah, yeah, Levi the tax collector. That's,
Okay.
I mean, and that's what church tradition would say.
Okay, so same different name, same guy.
Yeah, yeah. There's a
That's
lot
good
of
to know. I would not know that.
that.
That's helpful.
That's
Um,
common. That's common.
and all it said about him was a Jew of Galilee.
Hmm.
That's all it said.
Yeah, a Jew of Galilee who again is very interested in Jesus being as Jewish as possible, if that makes sense, and fulfilling all of the Abrahamic and Davidic prophecies.
Okay, so going through my notes here. Okay, my first question. Okay,
Mhm.
so Matthew 1, this is like you said before, this is kind of just like background genealogy going through
Mhm.
these are who all these folks are.
Mhm.
We then have the angel Gabriel coming to Joseph in a dream
Mhm.
and saying like it's okay, your wife is not a slut.
Yeah, yeah,
This is a holy child, don't worry. She's
yeah.
okay. The baby's okay. It's the Holy Spirit. The Holy
Mhm.
Spirit is with you.
Yeah.
Your wife ain't a hoe.
Right, right, right.
Okay, so that's Matthew 1. Um,
Hmm.
so Matthew 2,
Hmm.
this is where I did start to have some questions. So,
Yes.
okay, I have little subtitles in italics that are given in the book, which are helpful
Hmm.
for some of the narrative, but I always remember, these are put in. Don't
Can't
always
trust.
trust the maybe. Don't always
Yeah.
trust the subtitles. But so okay, so the first part though is the visit of the Magi.
Yes.
Um, and like I've heard this story so many times. Like this is one of the most common Bible stories that's reiterated that everyone's heard,
Mhm.
everyone knows. But when I actually sat down and read this part, there was something that or I guess a part of it that I hadn't read or thought about before.
Mhm.
Um, from this depiction, which has the wise men, the Magi. It seems like they're kind of like working for King Herod.
No, not quite.
Do,
So, but
okay,
I
do
see
you
what
know what
I
I'm
see
saying?
where
Do you know
you're
what I'm
going.
saying though? So
Yeah,
like they
yeah.
they kind of phrase it as like Herod sends them to like go to Bethlehem and like look for the
Right.
star, and then
Hmm.
and they get there and they're like, oh no, like we love him, we're gonna praise him, um,
Yeah.
and kind of fuck King Herod.
Right.
We're not gonna do his thing. But that was one of my questions was like, yo, who are these guys working for? Like, what is their
Yeah. So yeah. So this is so it's funny actually. But the last sermon I preached at church was this story.
okay?
It's called Epiphany Sunday. It's January 6th ish around that time. The Magi. Funny thing about the Magi, it never says a number, so we don't know that there's three. Doesn't specify gender, anything like that. So there could have been 30. Who knows? We know there's three gifts. And they definitely come long after Jesus is born, like probably about 2 years. Um,
2 years.
and yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because Herod's edict after this says kill every baby under 2 years old. So he must think that Jesus is,
Okay.
yeah, about 2 years old. So uh, the Magi are from the East, which almost certainly means modern day Persia, or not modern day, but Persia
Mhm.
at the time, the Kingdom of Persia, and they're almost certainly Zoroastrian priests of some sort.
Mhm.
Uh, Magi comes from a Greek word magios, which means just like it's the same word that we use to like translate magician. Um,
Okay.
and they were likely of like a priestly caste of people in that culture and society. And all of this goes back to the book of Isaiah. So the book of Isaiah says that a young girl will give birth to a son, name him Emmanuel, and that people, kings and people from other nations will come and visit him and pay him homage. And so Matthew makes sure that we see this happen. But the Magi story is very interesting. One, they're actually in real life not quote unquote kings,
Mm-hmm.
and they are probably not the most respected people. Yet they come and they're able to see Jesus. And this was kind of what I was talking about in my sermon. Was I was like, it's often the unseen in the birth stories that get to see Jesus, whether it's the shepherds, the unwed teenager, Virgin Mary. All of these people are kind of like, in some way, shape, or form, cast to the side in society. So they're foreigners, they're Gentiles, they're not Jewish, all of those things. When they come, they see Herod. Herod's the sort of puppet king. Rome appoints him as king of the Jews, and really he just does the bidding of Rome. All historical accounts of Herod are pretty terrible. He kills his brothers who, because he's worried they're going to cede the throne and things like that. Kills many of his wives. So historically, outside of the Bible, we have pretty rough views of Herod in general. So it seems consistent with the Bible. So they see Herod because Herod is the current king, and they go, "Hey, we're looking at the stars, right?" And again, they're probably into astrology and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Something else that would not be accepted in this Jewish community. So again, really, really interesting that things that are not orthodox or acceptable become centered in these stories around Jesus. Just more things with Jesus, right? This is a common theme even throughout all these different gospels. Like Jesus seems to always be close to things that are like you're not supposed to do that.
I like
and
that.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. And so they're following the stars. There's some theories that the star was Halley's comet. I think there was like a seeing of Halley's comet around this time or something like that. But I've seen mixed, scholars are mixed on that. But whatever it was, they see something that signals to them that a king is going to be born. That threatens Herod, and so Herod tries to deceive them, and he says, he brings him into a room and closes the door. And the fact that Matthew makes sure to say um, that he meets with them in private is supposed to signal to the reader or listener that Herod's not to be trusted. Because in first century Palestinian society, you didn't do your bidding in private unless you were doing something devious.
Does
Um,
it specifically say that this was behind closed doors?
yeah, let me,
I
it's
didn't catch that.
to, yeah, so verse 7, then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time the star had appeared, and then he sent them.
Wait, this is two. Wait,
This would be 2:7.
okay, 2-7. Wait, tell me what yours says again.
It says, then Herod secretly. Hold on, I gotta go back one. Oh shoot, I just X'd out of
Oh,
it.
this
I think
okay.
it said,
Does say. Okay, wait. Sorry, you say yours and then I'll say mine.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
little bit different.
It's Let me just go back real quick. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared.
Okay, so the wording over here
Mm-hmm.
says, "Then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men,
Mm-hmm.
inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared."
Oh, good
But
old King
the
James.
thing, like it is similar, but I do think
Yeah.
the
It,
subtle wording difference does have some different
yeah.
implications.
I was gonna
But like
say
when
that. So
I read this, it didn't seem sketch at all to me.
yeah, yeah. And
But
I
the
mean,
way
I think,
you worded it, that does seem a little bit sketch.
yeah, when you say secretly, it seems more sketch. But
Yeah.
even private, like the idea of doing anything in private, and this is something you'd have to understand from just like context in general,
Mhm.
or like historical context. And actually, one of the places I got that was from. Here's that book. This is if anyone is interested in like good commentary that's kind of easy to read. There's a whole series of these books, the social science commentary. So this is on the synoptic gospel. So this has Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it tells you it incorporates all of the social ideas of the time so that you better understand the time period. And So that's actually where I picked that up from. That things done in secret in this society where it was not respected. And again, Matthew is talking to a very specific audience.
Mm-hmm.
So we always have to remember that. Like this is with anything in the Bible, but definitely with the Gospels, like they weren't necessarily written to us; they were written to
Mm-hmm.
specific audiences. So Matthew is writing to an audience who is going to hear that and go like, "Oh, you met with them secretly or in private or whatever." Okay,
He's
Herod's.
up to no
I mean,
good.
and they would already know Herod's not a good guy, but it just
Right.
further drives that point home. So he meets with them in secret, and then he sends them, and then later in the story, they discern, which is kind of how we figure out that they're wise, quote unquote. They discern that Herod has poor intentions. So after they pay homage to Jesus, it says they left by a different road, basically. So basically, they told Herod they would come back and let him know where the child was, and then they completely resist Herod. There's a little civil disobedience there.
Well, in part of the wording, which was also kind of interesting to me, after it said that they didn't come back, because this wording was pretty clear that they didn't come back. But it also seems that, and the next part of this story is Herod killing all of the babies.
Right, right,
Um, the massacre of the innocents.
right. Yeah,
Say shout out to Reverend Mike. I listen in chapel.
yeah. There you go.
At our chapels
Than
and
like
yeah,
90% of the kids.
yeah. I do know this story from chapel. But one of the things that I also found that was interesting in this story here, or like actually reading it, um, is that it even seemed that like Herod was offended by the Magi not returning.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
like this wording said it's like he felt mocked by the wise men.
Right, right.
He was personally offended
Yeah.
that they didn't come back and like report back to him immediately
Mhm.
of the message that he sent them on. So kill all of the babies.
Yeah,
The next logical step, right?
yeah, yeah. For Herod, that's the next logical
Yeah.
step. So yeah, and so that's I mean, and that it's interesting that the for the wise men to take up so much of our nativity scenes and everything, there's only 10 verses on.
Are they so obviously they're not in the other. Well, okay, that was another interesting difference I noticed between these two books, between Matthew and
And
Luke,
yeah,
was that in Matthew we have the focus on the wise men,
hmm,
and on Luke there's no mention of the wise men, but we have the focus on the shepherds.
yes, the shepherds, yeah. So
So
that so
and granted, like maybe we'll. I mean, I'm sure at some point we will read the other gospels and the other interpretations of the story.
yes,
But one of my questions when I was reading this was, are they always separate? Because like when I
mhm,
started reading both of these and how the purpose of both of the chapters were presented, it does align kind of with Matthew focusing on the wise men, these people that have like some sort of like slightly more divine authority, if that
mhm,
is the purpose of this book. And then when we're looking at Luke, focusing on the shepherds, the common people who are out
right,
like doing the work. But
yeah,
but whenever I've heard this story presented in the past, it's all together.
right.
Are these
So
stories ever presented together in any of these books?
yeah, no, they're never presented together, and I think this is one of the interesting things about studying the Bible, um, versus when you sort of learn it in church or anything like that.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, especially with like the Christmas story, for example, they're trying to harmonize four different stories, and so and in this case, it's two different stories, but still, they're taking two different stories and they're trying to put them together. And then there's actual things that conflict. Like I think it's in Luke. It describes where. Let me make sure I have this right. I think it describes where Jesus is born as more of a cave, and it doesn't mention the inn. Let me just make sure I didn't get that wrong. Either way, only one of them I'm trying to I'm not gonna find it at this point. But either way, only one of them mentions the inn. And this is common in the gospels. Like there are literally things that conflict with each other in the gospels. And there are some stories that get paralleled, but there are also things that are completely unique to John or completely unique to Matthew or completely unique to Mark. And again, it's something that people are uncomfortable with nowadays that people don't need to be uncomfortable with, that weren't uncomfortable with back then, is that things in the Bible conflict with each other. That was just something that was understood and it was a part of the conversation. And remember, like when I was talking about the different gospels and how they formed in communities, so there's a Johannine community and a Matthean community and a Lukean community, like they were passing around different stories and ideas about Jesus. And it wasn't until really like, I mean, I guess a little bit before Constantine, but like when the church starts to get organized, and definitely when Constantine starts to call these councils together, that they're like, we need one unified story. Because that's what happens when empire takes control of something. You need it to be succinct and sort of like straightforward. But that's never really been what it's about, and that's okay. And I think people need to be okay with knowing that you're reading a really complex set of literature, and there are going to be things that differ, and that these are different authors at different times in different places.
Yeah, I mean that does make me think, or I guess part of where that goes with me is like, I'm when it comes to me questioning things and questioning text and questioning cooperation,
Mm-hmm.
it's one thing if there are completely different stories.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if one book is saying one thing and one is saying another thing, but if it's different stories. But this is the same story.
Yeah.
And I guess like, I mean, one of my questions that I also have thinking about this is like, the parallel between both of these stories is that people are coming to
Mm-hmm.
witness this miraculous birth.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any sort of theory somewhere that there was only one group of people that came? And am I word? Do you get what I'm saying?
But I think I
Like,
understand you're saying that
like,
that
like,
like maybe the shepherds really came and the magi didn't, or maybe the magi really
or,
came and the
well,
shepherds.
maybe like only one group of people came, and both interpretations are just spinning it in a way that fits the needs for how they are trying to frame the story.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah. So that is more or less the general consensus, is like that. Again, most people agree that Jesus is a real person who was born in Nazareth and potentially in Bethlehem, but some people argue that doesn't make sense. But regardless, a real person who was born and existed, and Mary and Joseph were probably his parents' names, and the whole 9 yards. All the people who are inserted in the text, and this is a common thing in the Bible, I used to be really concerned with like how true is it? Like how true is it that the Magi were there? How true is it that the shepherds were there?
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned over time is that it matters very little, because the what matters is what is the author of this text trying to communicate about Jesus. So, like, for example, if we get into Luke's gospel,
Mm-hmm.
the shepherds were ceremonially unclean. They were considered unclean because they worked with livestock, which means that they weren't allowed in the temple. And that really means that they weren't allowed to be reconciled to God, even though they took care of the sheep that were used in temple sacrifices. So for the angels to appear to this unclean group signifies that Jesus is going to appear amongst people who are otherwise considered to not be able to have a relationship with God. Jesus is going to dwell among the outliers and the outsiders. Luke knows that when Luke is writing this, and Luke wants us to see that. And so it becomes less important whether the shepherds were real, and more important that we understand Jesus to be, and by nature of Jesus, God to be someone that wrote that is present among the oppressed. Like that's really what's trying to be communicated here. We can gather that the real Jesus cared for the oppressed. However true the shepherds being at his birth are, is not the point. The point is for us to understand that Jesus cared for the oppressed. And again, these stories are more historical than like the Genesis stories. So it's likely that he was born in the conditions that they say he was born in, and it would not have been unfathomable that shepherds would have been nearby, and things like that. But Luke isn't trying to get us to like understand some like authoritative piece of history. Luke is trying to give us a theology about who the person Jesus is.
I like that. I like that. Okay, and so this can kind of bring up another question with some of the chapters that you told me to read. And I'll be honest, it gave me a little bit of a Harry Potter connection. I don't know if you were expecting that one, but the birth of John. So John the Baptist is
Yes,
clearly
yes.
who is, this other character that
Mm-hmm.
we're learning about here.
Mm-hmm.
And so John the Baptist, putting together the family lineage, he's the cousin,
Yes.
of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say I had all these names wrong. I definitely I had names mixed up in my head for who I thought John the Baptist mom was, but it's Zacharias and Elizabeth are the
Yes.
parents.
Yes.
I got that from my readings.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess what was kind of interesting was, well, I guess, I've known the story, but it does come first in Luke.
Yeah.
The story of John's, well, and it's the same story.
Yeah.
Um,
So
it doesn't seem like it's necessarily like a divine like impregnation, if you
yeah.
will. Like, it's still Gabriel. Gabriel still comes in and says, I get that you haven't been able to have birth. Uh, you're gonna have a child. Trust in the Lord. Um,
Right.
and she gets pregnant, but it does seem like, that it's not as divine, but like kind of
Yeah.
divine.
Yeah.
Um, And so she gets pregnant with John. Elizabeth gets pregnant with John. And then Gabriel comes to Mary
Mm-hmm.
while Elizabeth is pregnant
Mm-hmm.
and says to Mary, like, you're gonna be pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Just got you pregnant. Um, you can trust me because I just told your cousin the same thing, and she's
Mm-hmm.
been keeping it a secret. But if you go talk to your cousin, she will validate that I'm legit.
Yeah.
It's legit. You're pregnant. It's the Lord. He is with you. Um, and but I guess what's interesting or just like kind of I would like some more clarity and clarification of kind of the purpose of like, you know, it's like John was not the chosen one. Like,
Yeah.
was this pregnancy with John? I guess kind of my interpretation so far is that like that was done with the purpose of giving Mary like a sense of safety or like a sense of validation that like you can
So a lot
trust.
of this really plays on who John the Baptist was. And so
Okay.
John the Baptist is a very prominent figure in first century Judaism. A really quick overview of movements in first century Judaism. You have Pharisees who we'll learn a lot about. So we'll definitely get to them. Sadducees, the Pharisees really want everyone to get back to the law. Sadducees really care about the temple and sort of the wealthy folks who are able to give proper sacrifices at the temple. Um, the Sadducees are concerned with like more of like a theocracy, if you will. There's the Zealots who were basically rebels. right? They just want to take over everything. They want to topple the Roman government, take everything over. And then there's the Essenes. And my interpretation, and this everyone doesn't agree with this, is that John the Baptist was an Essene. Essenes lived out in the wilderness. They retreated from the city. You think about that like monastic culture, like that monk culture. That was very much what they were. And if we haven't gotten to this yet, but when we get to more about John the Baptist as an adult, they'll describe him as living in the wilderness, as feeding on locusts and wild honey, wearing like camel, hair coats and things like that, right? Being hairy, like
I was
just
gonna
kind of
say he
being.
sounds kind of Appalachian,
Yeah,
the Middle
exactly,
Eastern,
yeah,
Middle Eastern
yeah,
version of mountain folk.
exactly, yeah. That's a good parallel. And so, but his movement was big, and he becomes John the Baptist, right? He starts the process of baptizing, which probably has some roots in like the Jewish mitzvah baths and some other like traditions. But as almost a way of initiating people into this new idea of the kingdom of God. And then he baptizes Jesus, and then Jesus' ministry starts. And so, if you've ever seen Jesus Christ Superstar, the first song is John the Baptist singing. Yeah,
I should. I will. I'll watch it. I will watch it. Have not.
it actually there's some good imagery in it. Like everyone, all the people in Jesus Christ Superstar, they're all like hippies and outcasts. So they actually did a really good job, kind of I think capturing the essence of the Jesus movement. But regardless, the first song is John the Baptist, and he sings, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord," because that's what John the Baptist says: "Prepare ye the way of the Lord." And the idea is that John the Baptist was really important, gained all these followers, and then when Jesus comes, sort of says, "Okay, now this is who I was preparing you for," and then prepares everything for Jesus, and then John the Baptist is beheaded, and Jesus sort of takes over from there. And so John the Baptist would have already been well known to the readers and hearers of this gospel, and sort of connecting their lives and their movements was very important to all the people that were listening. So their cousins, and what you do really in ancient times with any important figure is you sort of mark their importance through their birth. So you see this all throughout the Bible, where people are there's something sort of miraculous about their birth or their birth story. And you see that again with John the Baptist. It's not quite a virgin birth, but it is sort of Abraham and Sarah. It's the same
Well,
thing.
I was gonna say that's actually what the story reminded me more of, is like
Yeah.
a barren older mother,
Mm-hmm.
rather than like a young virgin birth.
Yeah. Now, two things, because I see where we got the 10-minute timer coming up. So, two things I want to point out that I think are really interesting and important whenever we're talking about the birth stories. One is to just get on the virgin birth. This was one of the first things that was a really big, like, what moment for me in seminary. So, I remember when I first got into seminary, first I thought I was going to study like history of the Bible, but then I realized you were really just studying like history of Christianity, and I wanted to do more of like Bible stuff. So then I kind of switched over to theology, and I remember we had to read this theologian named Athanasius, right? It's this really long treatise that he has on like why the virgin birth had to happen, like his whole theology about how Jesus could not have been born of a woman. And then I remember taking my first biblical studies class, which eventually became my concentration. And they pointed out the very simple fact that the prophecy in Isaiah never says that the Messiah will be born of a virgin. It says the Messiah will be born of a young girl.
Okay.
When it gets translated into Greek, into the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Septuagint, it gets translated inaccurately virgin. So now we have this story of this virgin birth that it seems like Matthew feels like.
So the whole concept of the virgin birth is a translation error.
Likely, right? Like, but it's funny
because
because
I mean, the thing is, like, that makes more sense than a virgin birth.
Yeah, and it's like blasphemous to say that. And people have all
Yeah.
these theories about why Jesus couldn't be born of a woman, and like I think believe whatever you want to believe, but it's that's an interesting thing to point out that like without that translation error, I don't know that we have this obsession with Mary needing to be a virgin, and I think it actually exposes some of our own biases, like the, God can't be born of a woman who's actually had sex. The what dirty
Forbid.
shame.
Heaven forbid.
Yeah, and it's just like that. It's like God. If God is going to come into Earth incarnate, He can do that in any way that God pleases. It doesn't have to be through a
I mean,
virgin.
honestly, I would say that's actually like far more logical than than
Yeah, than a
like
virgin birth.
a translation error makes me
Yeah,
believe it even more, actually.
right, right. The other thing that I think is really interesting is so we had the virgin birth and what was the the whole thing where Jesus is born in a stable and there was no room in the inn. So the
Mhm.
word inn comes from is not the way that we think of an inn like a motel or a hotel or something like that.
Mhm.
The inn is referencing the part of a first century Palestinian house that the people lived in. But the first floor of a first century Palestinian house is where the animals would be, where your livestock would be. So
Mhm.
you'd have like a basement floor, you'd have some livestock, you'd go upstairs, and that's where all the people would be.
Okay.
So it's likely that Mary and Joseph are visiting with family because it's around Passover. Family, it's too crowded where the family are, and they have to go down to where the animals are for Jesus to be born. And so that's probably the more accurate way of understanding
That
that.
actually,
Not
I mean,
quite.
that makes sense though.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, I feel like that's actually just a very logical explanation for a story that has never really felt logical or made sense.
yeah, yeah. So again, it makes it make sense. And I guess like if I was gonna wrap up the whole sort of Christmas story, everything like that is, and again, I said Luke is my favorite, but you can get some of this in Matthew too. Is just, and I've kind of said this through this episode, it is, I think, the most inspiring to me that Jesus is always near the unseen, whether it's these weird Zoroastrian priests from Persia, these shepherds that are supposed to be dirty and completely untouched and unclean, whether it's the fact that he's born to a teenage, Mary's likely like 13 years old, a teenage unwed mother, the fact that he's essentially homeless, the fact that they have to flee to another country and become refugees, right? All of this is in the Jesus story.
Mhm.
So when we make the religion of Jesus and following Jesus about helping the poor and disenfranchised, this isn't like woke politics taking over Christianity as some evangelicals would like to say. This is us really getting back to the root of the Jesus story and glorifying the humanity of Jesus like Luke does. Because if we're going to say that Jesus is both God and human, then we have to respect his human story. And a
Mhm.
lot of people don't like to do that. They make Jesus this like mascot, and it's just like he'll take all your pain away. He'll do it. He'll do this. He'll do that. And it's like, wait, but what about the real person, the Palestinian, brown skinned, like homeless dude that hung around prostitutes and shepherds and tax collectors? Like that's like if we're trying to emulate someone, we should understand what his life looked like and what first century Palestine looked like and what first century Judaism looked like. And you get a different picture, you get a much more revolutionary picture, to be honest. So that if there's anything I think that I would want people to walk away with is understand how revolutionary this story is from the beginning.
Hell yeah. I like
Yeah.
So yeah, so we're getting close to our Zoom time, but I guess my final question for you is so if we're gonna try to do this weekly, what should I read for next week? And if we have people listening, I think this was kind of our ultimate goal with this idea of the podcast is, having some readings to do next week. Do you know by any chance what readings I should do next week?
That's actually I should be more prepared.
It's okay, Dante. It's okay.
But
It's okay.
I will
Okay.
I will say
I
this.
kind of put
I
you on the
will
spot for that.
no, it's all good. And I will definitely put it up on Instagram. I'm kind of going through Luke right now. And just off the top of my head, where this story just generally goes, there's not much of Jesus' childhood. So we will probably talk a little bit about there's one more story in his childhood where he goes to visit the temple. And that's an important story for a lot of reasons. And then basically we get into the start of his ministry. So we go to his baptism, and it's just some of the first healings, miracles, and teachings. And really quickly, we're going to get to what I would argue is probably the central text for anyone that says they want to follow Jesus, and that's the Sermon on the Mount. So I
Okay.
would be on the lookout for that. And if that's not the very next thing we talk about, it'll be the episode after. It'll be 2 weeks from now. But
Okay.
there's a lot. I got this, Martin Luther King book here, and a little bit of Dietrich Bonhoeffer behind me. They have a lot to say about the Sermon on the Mount because that is really Jesus's, magnum
Like the
opus. Uh,
crux.
yeah. That's turn the other cheek. It's love your neighbor. It's all of those things. So we're definitely headed in that direction.
Okay.
Before we run out of time, thank you guys for listening as always. Again, bourbon underscore Bible underscore stories on Instagram. We're gonna try to get this to you weekly. We thank you so much for all the support and loving things that you guys have had to say to us. We love doing this.
And as always too, yeah, let us know if you have any questions, if there are any stories you want to hear about. Yeah, we're open, we're flexible. And
All
we're
right.
trying to come at you weekly.
Yes, sir. All right. Cheers, guys.
Ching ching. Buenas noches, amigos.